My name is Morgan, and I never imagined I would be writing this. I never thought I would have a story worth telling, until the night I died. It was an ordinary evening, just like any other. I had dinner, watched TV, and went to bed around 10:30 p.m. The day had been long, filled with the usual responsibilities, work, errands, small conversations that I barely remembered by the end of the night. I felt a little more exhausted than usual, but I dismissed it as stress. I lay in bed, thinking about my to-do list for the next day. My mind wandered between deadlines, chores, and plans for the weekend. My body felt heavy, my eyelids grew heavier. And then, nothing. I didn't wake up. At least, not in the way I expected. I was suddenly aware, but my body was no longer in bed. I found myself floating above it, looking down at my own motionless form. The stillness in the room felt unnatural. My chest wasn't rising. My breath wasn't coming. The clock on my nightstand continued ticking, but time felt irrelevant. Panic should have set in, but it didn't. Instead, there was a strange, eerie calm. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and I was seeing the world in a way I never had before. And then, everything changed. A bright, radiant light filled the room, not from the lamp or the moon outside, but from something beyond human comprehension. It wasn't just light, it was alive. Warmth, love, and power radiated from it. I felt it pulling me, drawing me in. That's when I realized, I was leaving. I tried to resist, to stay, to hold on to the world I had always known. But no amount of willpower could fight against the force that carried me forward. And then, in an instant, the world I had known faded away. I didn't feel pain. I didn't feel fear. Just darkness. But not the kind of darkness you see when you close your eyes. It was deeper, heavier, like sinking into an endless ocean. A silence so vast it swallowed everything, yet it wasn't empty. It was alive, pulsing, waiting. Then, I heard a sound. A faint buzzing at first, growing louder. It was strange, almost like distant voices whispering, but I couldn't make out the words. My body felt weightless, as though I was floating, suspended in an abyss where time didn't exist. I opened my eyes, and I wasn't in my room anymore. I was above it. I looked down and saw my own body lying motionless on the bed. My chest wasn't rising, my hands were limp at my sides. The alarm clock on the nightstand blinked a steady, unchanging time. Everything was still. Unnaturally still. I should have panicked, but instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. It was as if I had shed every worry, every burden, every earthly attachment. My thoughts were clearer than ever, my senses sharper. The air around me felt thick with something I couldn't describe, something beyond human comprehension. Then, I noticed something else, a light. Not from the window, not from a lamp, but from somewhere beyond. It grew brighter, warmer, until it filled everything around me. It wasn't harsh or blinding. Instead, it felt like a gentle embrace, wrapping around me like the arms of someone who had been waiting for me all along. I felt myself being pulled toward it. It wasn't like walking or flying, it was effortless, like the light itself was guiding me, calling me. I knew, in the deepest part of my soul, that this wasn't just any light. It was alive. It knew me. It was drawing me in, not by force, but by love. For a moment, I hesitated. A part of me clung to the world I had left behind, the life I thought I was still living. But that life felt distant now, like a dream fading upon waking. The light was more real than anything I had ever known. And then, I surrendered. The moment I did, everything changed. The darkness disappeared, and I was engulfed in warmth, in brilliance, in something far beyond human words. I had crossed over. And what I saw next changed everything. As I moved upward, the light around me shifted. It was no longer just white, it had a golden hue, like sunlight filtering through the clouds after a storm. It wasn't just light, it was alive, pulsing with warmth, with love, with something greater than anything I had ever felt. It surrounded me, embraced me, and for the first time in my existence, I understood what it meant to truly belong. Then, I saw him. Jesus. He stood before me, dressed in white, radiating an aura so intense that I could barely see his face at first. But I didn't need to. My soul recognized him before my eyes did. Every fiber of my being knew who he was. His presence was overwhelming, not in a fearful way, but in a way that made me feel completely known and unconditionally loved. I couldn't speak. Every question, every doubt, every worry that had ever plagued me seemed insignificant in his presence. The weight of my past, my failures, my fears, they all faded away. Before him, I was stripped of every mask I had ever worn, every defense I had ever built. And yet, I felt no shame. Only love. Only acceptance. Then, he reached out his hand. "You don't have to be afraid," he said. His voice wasn't just sound, it was truth itself, resonating through me like an echo in eternity. It carried power, yet it was gentle, filled with such deep kindness that I felt my very soul tremble. Slowly, hesitantly, I placed my hand in his. The moment I did, warmth surged through me. Not just warmth, life. It was as if every cell in my being was infused with light, with love, with something so pure and divine that I couldn't contain it. Every fear, every regret, every doubt I had ever carried melted away in an instant. I felt whole. For the first time in my existence, I felt complete. "You're not finished yet," he said softly. His words confused me. Hadn't I already died? If so, why was I here? Wasn't this the end? Jesus smiled. A smile so full of knowing, so full of love, that it made me want to weep. "Come," he said. "I need to show you something." And with that, everything around me shifted. The golden light swirled, and suddenly, I wasn't standing in an empty space anymore. I was being taken somewhere. And I knew, whatever he was about to show me would change everything. The scene around us shifted. The warm golden light that had surrounded me faded, and I found myself in a different place. A stark, frozen landscape stretched endlessly before me. The air was heavy, thick with an eerie silence. Jagged peaks loomed in the distance, their icy surfaces reflecting the dim, gray light of an overcast sky. Snow and ice blanketed everything, suffocating the land beneath it. In the middle of this frozen wasteland, a massive airplane sat trapped in the ice. Its wings, once meant to soar through the skies, were now locked in thick, immovable sheets of frost. The engines were silent. No lights blinked from the cockpit. It was as if time had frozen along with it. I turned to Jesus, confusion rising within me. "What is this?" I asked. His face was solemn, his eyes deep with sorrow. "It's what's coming," he replied. "And it's closer than you think." He led me closer, and I saw something chilling. Through the frosted windows of the plane, people were huddled together inside. Their faces were filled with fear and confusion. Some were crying, others sat in shock, unmoving. Their breath fogged up the windows, their bodies shivering from the cold. But it wasn't just the cold that terrified them. Each person clutched a small, glowing device in their hands. The devices emitted a faint red glow, but they weren't working. The passengers tapped them, shook them, desperately trying to make them function. Their fingers trembled as they pressed the screens, but nothing happened. "They've become dependent on it," Jesus said. "And now, they can't function without it." I watched as panic spread among them. Some pounded on the windows, their mouths moving in silent cries for help. Others held their devices close to their chests, rocking back and forth as if clinging to them for comfort. A few had collapsed into their seats, their eyes empty, as though their very will to live had been drained from them. They were promised safety, Jesus continued. They were promised security. But they did not see the chains being placed around them. I turned to him, my heart pounding. What happened to them? They trusted in the system, he said. They trusted in men. And now, when the system fails, they are lost. I felt a cold dread settle in my chest. This wasn't just about a broken piece of technology. It was something far deeper. These people had surrendered their independence, their ability to think, to survive, to function without the constant presence of this device. And now, stripped of it, they had nothing. They were warned, Jesus said gently. But they did not listen. I turned back to the plane, my breath catching as I saw something new. Outside, in the snow, there were others, people who were not inside the plane. They had no glowing devices in their hands. They were dressed in simple, rugged clothing, their faces marked by hardship but also by something else, determination. They moved together, walking through the snow, carrying supplies, helping one another. They were cold, but they were alive. They did not shiver in fear. They did not look lost. Their steps were steady, their eyes filled with light. Jesus pointed toward them. These are the ones who refused, he said. They did not accept what the world offered them. They chose a harder path, but now, they are free. A lump formed in my throat. I could see it so clearly now. The plane, the ice, the people trapped inside, it was all a representation of what was to come. A world so dependent on a false security that, when it was taken away, people would be left powerless. And yet, there was hope. Hope in those who had chosen differently. They will be hunted, Jesus said. They will be called enemies. But they will endure. I turned back to him, my heart aching. What do I do with this? How do I warn them? Jesus looked at me, his eyes filled with both sorrow and love. Tell them, he said. Tell them before it is too late. And with that, the vision faded. The frozen wasteland, the plane, the people, it all dissolved into light. I gasped, my body jolting as I found myself back in my own reality. But I knew, deep in my soul, that nothing would ever be the same again. Inside the plane, the atmosphere was eerie, silent, but not in a peaceful way. It was the silence of resignation, of slow surrender. The passengers remained huddled in their seats, clutching their glowing devices like lifelines. But the devices were failing them. At the front of the cabin, a man stood. He was well-dressed, polished, with an air of authority. His smile was reassuring, his voice smooth and confident as he spoke. Help is coming, he told them. His tone was calm, persuasive, as if he truly believed it. Everything is under control. The passengers nodded weakly, their hope fragile but still clinging to his words. They wanted to believe him. They needed to believe him. But as I looked closer, a chill ran through me. Behind his smile, his eyes were empty. Hollow. There was no real conviction in his words. He didn't believe them himself. He wasn't comforting the others because he had faith, he was doing it because it was the only thing he knew how to do. They don't see it, I whispered, feeling an ache in my chest. No, Jesus said beside me, his voice both sorrowful and firm. Because they've been blinded. I turned to look at him, and his eyes reflected a deep sadness, not for himself, but for them. For all of them. The enemy didn't force them here, he continued. He led them, step by step. He promised progress. Convenience. Safety. And they followed. I looked back at the passengers. They had the appearance of people at rest, curled up in their seats, their faces serene. Their hands still clutched the devices that pulsed weakly with a red glow. But the peace was an illusion. They think they are safe, I said. Jesus nodded. But they aren't. They've traded their freedom for comfort. And soon, they won't even realize what they've lost. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. I could see it now, how the world had led them to this place. How they had been conditioned, little by little, to depend on the very thing that would enslave them. First, it had been convenience. A faster way to pay. A simpler way to access information. A system that eliminated risk, that made life easier. Then, it became necessity. Without it, they couldn't work, couldn't travel, couldn't function in society. And now they sat in this frozen wasteland, powerless. Trapped. I walked down the aisle, looking at their faces. Some were still awake, staring blankly ahead, as if they were waiting for something, waiting for the world to fix itself, for someone to come and make it all better. Others were slipping away, their heads resting against the seats, their eyes fluttering shut. Not from exhaustion, but from something else. A slow, creeping surrender. I stopped beside a woman with silver streaks in her hair. Her face was peaceful, her breathing slow. The device in her hands was dimming, the glow fading. But she didn't seem to notice. I wanted to shake her, to wake her up, to tell her to fight. But she was already too far gone. I turned back to Jesus, my heart pounding. Can they be saved? His expression was heavy with sorrow. Some will wake up, he said. Some will see before it's too late. But many, he paused, glancing toward the slumbering passengers. Many will not. A lump formed in my throat. I wanted to scream, to run through the aisles and shout for them to open their eyes, to see the chains being placed on them. But they couldn't hear me. They wouldn't hear me. They trust the voice that tells them what they want to hear, Jesus said. The voice that tells them they don't have to fight. That all will be well if they just let go. I clenched my fists. But it's a lie. Yes. I turned back to the man at the front. His voice was still steady, still soothing. But I saw him for what he was now, not a leader, not a protector, but a puppet of the system that had led them here. He wasn't guiding them to safety. He was lulling them into captivity. I took a step toward him, anger rising in my chest. Why is he doing this? Doesn't he see? Jesus placed a hand on my shoulder. Some do not want to see. Some would rather believe the lie, because the truth requires sacrifice. The truth requires sacrifice. I looked again at the people, at their peaceful expressions, at the glow of the devices fading in their hands. They had chosen comfort. And in doing so, they had lost themselves. A deep sadness settled over me as I stepped back, feeling the weight of everything I had seen. They still have a choice, Jesus said softly. But it will not be easy. I swallowed hard. And those who refuse? Jesus turned, and suddenly, the scene shifted. We were no longer inside the plane. We were outside, in the snow-covered wasteland, where the others, the ones who had refused the system, walked through the cold. They had no glowing devices. No comforts. But their eyes were filled with light. Their steps were strong. They were free. Jesus looked back at me. The choice is theirs. But they must make it soon. The vision blurred, fading into light. And then, I was back. Suddenly, a deep, reverberating crack echoed through the frozen wasteland. The ice around the plane split apart, jagged lines racing across the surface like veins of an unseen force breaking through. From the ground beneath, something dark began to seep up. It wasn't just shadows, it was alive. A black, writhing mist coiled around the plane's wings, creeping toward the fuselage like grasping fingers. The very air around it grew heavy, oppressive. I felt a deep sense of urgency. Something was coming. Something final. I turned to Jesus, my heart pounding. What's happening? It's not too late, he said, his voice steady but firm. But soon, the door will close. He raised his hand. And at that moment, light burst through the cracks in the ice. Golden beams shot out, colliding with the darkness, forcing it to retreat. The shadows hissed, recoiling as if in pain, curling back into the cracks from which they had emerged. The light spread, racing toward the plane, piercing through the windows and illuminating the inside. The passengers stirred. At first, just a few. Eyes fluttered open. Heads lifted groggily as if waking from a deep, unnatural sleep. A man blinked rapidly, looking at his hands as if seeing them for the first time in years. Another clutched his chest, taking deep, gasping breaths as if he had been suffocating. Then, at the front of the plane, a woman stood up. She was trembling, her body weak, but her eyes, held something different. Awareness. Recognition. And tears. She looked toward Jesus, her lips quivering, her voice breaking. "Help us," she cried. Jesus nodded. His expression was one of infinite love, infinite patience. "Faith," he said. "Even now, it's enough." A rumbling filled the air. The ice that had trapped the plane began to melt. Water rushed down its sides, breaking apart the chains that had held it captive. Inside, more passengers were waking up. Some were confused, glancing around as if trying to piece together where they were, what had happened to them. Others gasped as the red glow of their devices flickered and died. I saw the realization dawn on their faces. The horror. The disbelief. Some dropped their devices immediately, as if holding them burned their hands. Others clutched them desperately, as if still unwilling to let go, their minds battling between truth and illusion. Then, the plane began to lift. Not with engines. Not with force. But by the same light that had shattered the darkness. It was rising, freed. I turned to Jesus, the weight of everything pressing into me. "I understand now," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just about technology, it's about trust. They trusted the world more than they trusted you." Jesus smiled, a knowing, gentle smile. "Now you need to tell them." The scene blurred, fading into a blinding glow. And then, I woke up. In an instant, I felt a powerful pull, like an unseen force yanking me backward through time and space. The radiant light, the plane, the melting ice, all of it blurred into nothingness, vanishing as if I were being ripped away from a world beyond this one. Then, pain. A sharp, burning sensation filled my chest, like fire spreading through my ribs. My lungs ached as if they had been empty for far too long. My body convulsed, and I gasped, desperate for air. I was back. The sounds of the hospital room came rushing in, a chaotic symphony of beeping monitors, hurried footsteps, and urgent voices. The bright, sterile lights above me were harsh, almost unbearable after the divine glow I had just left. "He's awake," a voice shouted. I turned my head slightly, my vision still swimming, and saw a doctor leaning over me. Her face was filled with relief, but beneath it, there was something else, shock. "You were gone for 16 minutes, she said, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe her own words. "We thought we lost you." I tried to speak, but my throat felt like sandpaper. My lips parted, but no words came out. There was so much I wanted to say, to tell them what I had seen, what Jesus himself had shown me. But how could I? How could I put into words something so beyond human comprehension? I looked around the room, my mind still reeling. Nurses moved swiftly, checking my vitals, adjusting IVs, making sure my heart was stable. I could hear the soft hum of machines, the murmuring of medical staff discussing how this was impossible. They didn't understand. How could they? I wasn't just unconscious. I wasn't just out. I was gone. I had seen the divide between those who were waking up and those who were blindly surrendering. I had stood before Jesus and heard his voice with my soul. And now, I was back. The doctor spoke again, but I wasn't listening. My thoughts were racing, my heart pounding, not from fear, but from purpose. I had to tell them. I had to warn them. But I also knew that not everyone would believe. Some would dismiss it. Some would mock it. Others would say it was just a hallucination, a near-death delusion. But I knew the truth. What I had seen was real. More real than this world. My time had not yet come. That was why I had been sent back. To share what was coming. Because soon, everything would change. Days later, as I lay in my hospital bed recovering, the weight of what I had seen pressed heavily on my chest. My body was weak, but my mind was racing. I couldn't let this fade like a dream. I had to remember everything, every word Jesus spoke, every vision he showed me. This wasn't just a personal revelation. It wasn't meant for me alone. It was a warning for the world. I reached for a notebook by my bedside, my hands trembling. I started to write. Every detail, every moment, every truth that had been revealed to me. I wrote because I had to tell them. Because the world was walking blindly into a trap. Not through war. Not through violence. But through comfort. The enemy wasn't coming with chains. He wasn't forcing people into submission. No, his greatest weapon was deception. He was making the chains look like freedom. He was leading people step by step, offering them convenience, offering them security, promising them a world where everything was easier, safer, more efficient. And the world was accepting it. They weren't being dragged. They were walking willingly. Technology isn't the enemy. It has brought knowledge, connection, advancements that have saved lives. But the danger isn't in the tool, it's in the dependence. In the trust. When people trust the system more than they trust God, that's when the trap is complete. And that's what Jesus showed me. A future where people will welcome it. Where they will embrace it. Where they will celebrate it as progress. And step by step, without even realizing it, they will give up their freedom. Their faith. Their connection to God. Until one day, they wake up, and it's too late. I saw the moment when people realized what they had lost. I saw the horror in their eyes. But by then, they were already trapped. The system was already in place. The decision had already been made. And the cost of turning back was more than most were willing to pay. But then, Jesus showed me something else. Not everyone was blind. Not everyone accepted it. There were those who saw the truth. Those who refused to be controlled, who refused to trade faith for comfort. They were cast out. They were called extremists, outlaws, enemies of progress. The world rejected them. But Jesus did not. He provided for them. He guided them. He protected them. Because they chose faith over fear. Because they chose trust over convenience. And in the end, they were the ones who were truly free. The choice is coming. And everyone will have to make it. Wake up. Before the door closes.